So today I will be talking about pretext invariant representation learning, also called PIRL. The idea is to just give you the basic intuition behind pretext invariant representation learning so that you can probably use some of its concepts while solving your own problems. So firstly, I request all of you to keep your mics muted and unmute yourself only when you want to ask a question. Feel free to stop me at any point of time if you have any questions. I will pause in the middle between certain sections to just give you time to ask questions. But you can stop me anytime in the middle as well. Okay, sorry. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Divyam and I'm currently working as an extern with Launchpad.ai. I finished my fellowship in December 2019. So I was part of the September 2019 to December 2019 cohort. Okay, so before I begin talking about PIRL, let's just revisit the idea behind transfer learning. So transfer learning has been a very successful approach and was also one of the key aspects of the FastAI library that all of you guys are using. So transfer learning essentially has two stages. Firstly, we initialize the model with the weights trained on with weights of a previously successful model, such as the ImageNet, such as the model trained on the ImageNet data set. Later, you can fine tune this model to work on most of the other image classification problems as well. But then one of the key problems while using transfer learning is it might not always be feasible to have a pre-trained model in the domain that you're working on. So for example, we were lucky to have a pre-trained model in ImageNet, but ImageNet itself has about 14 million images, and it takes about 22 human years to label this data set. So you might be working on a problem where you might have lots of data, but not all the data would be labeled. So in such cases, you still want to make use of something like transfer learning. So this is where the idea of PIRL comes in. If you sort of want to have a good starting point that transfer learning gives you, you can make use of this approach called PIRL. Okay, so PIRL is essentially a self-supervised learning technique. So what you do in self-supervised learning is you enable learning representations of the data by just observing how different parts of data interact. So this sort of drops the requirement of huge annotated data to an extent, because you can just start with a basic model which has learned certain interactions within the data, and then just fine tune it on the limited labeled data that you have. So just one example of self-supervised learning pretext task is you have an image which is not labeled. So all you want to do is rotate it by a certain angle and then make the model predict the angle that you have rotated it by. So this is a very simple, classification problem. I can have like 4 categories, say 90 degree, 180 degree, 270 degrees, and 360 degrees. And I can just, start rotating images and ask the model to predict what the rotated angle is. So let's break down self-supervised learning problems in computer vision. So a self-supervised learning problem essentially has two tasks. One is the downstream task, which is the final task that you're trying to solve. This can be anything like a classification or a detection task, but you have insufficient annotated data. And now you have a pre-task. This is the task that you solve before solving the downstream task to sort of give you a good starting point like transfer learning. So the pretext task is the self-supervised learning task solved to learn visual representations with the aim of using the learned representations of model weights obtained in process for the downstream task. So this is sort of you're sort of creating an alternative to transfer learning when you have insufficient labeled data. Okay, so the mentioned paper, the PIRL paper, I have put the link towards the end and I will share these slides with you. The PIRL paper talks about performing data augmentations, but instead of performing the properties of the transformation that you perform, what you want to do is you want to make the representations of the two images converge. So this is the image before applying the transformation, and this is the image after applying the transformation. So what you want to do is make the final layer embeddings of this image converge to those of the transformed image. So in more formal terms, you have an image I, you're applying a transformation IT. So here you're applying the jigsaw transformation. So you divide the image into multiple patches and then you rearrange the patches. So that is the transformation that you're applying. So in a standard pretext learning problem, what you do is you simply train the model to predict the property of T. So in this case, it would be the perhaps the coordinates of the jigsaw masks that you have generated over here. So in pretext invariant representation learning, what you do is you take the embeddings of the initial image, and you also take the embeddings of the transformed image, and you train this whole model to sort of converge the two representations. This is very similar to Siamese networks. If you have worked with them before, the basic idea behind both of them is quite similar between PIRL and Siamese networks, but there are a few different. Transformations T. So what we are essentially doing is we are trying to learn parameters theta of the network, and the image representation vector vi would be given by phi theta or phi. So this is the final layer image embedding that you get by applying the model, the convolutional neural network to the image I. So what you're essentially doing is we are trying to train the network to minimize. Yeah, we are trying to train the network to minimize the empirical risk. So we are defining a loss between Vi and VIT, and we are essentially trying to minimize this loss, the average loss over the whole data set. So this is what we define as the empirical risk that we are trying to minimize. But now the problem with this expression is we are just trying to minimize the loss between Vi and Vi transform. We are not, we also want the loss to be greater for or Vi and Vi dash, where I dash is, you know, any other image. You're not only trying to converge the image representations between Vi and VIT, but you also want the representations between Vi and any other random image Vi dash to diverge. You want these two representations to be different from each other. So essentially, again, in more formal terms, you're trying to, you want images that are the same to be close by in the vector space and images that are different to be far away in the vector space. So to introduce this other aspect of, you know, being far away from negative examples or the negative class, we introduce this idea of contrastive loss function. So this is the minus, this is the negative logarithm of the softmax. We define softmax a little differently over here. We use the similarity within it, the similarity between the two representations that you are trying to converge when they are similar. So this value becomes, this whole logarithm value becomes 0 when Zi and Zj converge, and this sort of tends to negate to infinity when Zi and Zj are different, when they are divergent. Do you guys have any questions at this point of time? Because I think it's very important to understand the basic idea behind pretext invariant representation learning before I go further into the math. So are you guys clear on what we are trying to achieve over here?
Can you explain what you mean by like encourage the two representations to like converge to like what exactly do you mean by converge? Like what should the output look like?
Okay, so this will be a whole model. There are two, there is a twin convolutional neural network over here. You're going to train this whole thing at once. So what you're going to do is you're going to pass I to one of them, and you're going to transform I and pass I transform to the other one. and you will be computing a loss between these two representations. This loss between Vi and Vi transform. So this is your Vi and this is your Vi transform. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to minimize the distance between Vi and Vi transform. So you want Vi to be equal to Vi transform. That is, you want your network to be invariant of such transformations. So essentially applying any transformation like this jigsaw transformation should give you the same image embedding representation as you would get without applying the transformation.
Oh,
Is
okay,
that
okay.
clear?
Yeah, okay, I got it.
Yeah. Anyone else has any other questions?
So like in this kind of learning, we don't really need the downstream task like in jigsaw solving, right? In jigsaw solving, we try to find the coordinates of the separate pieces of images. Here, we don't really need to do that. We just need to apply the transform.
Rather, we are defining the pretext task a little differently. We are trying to build an alternative to transfer learning, right?
Okay.
That is the very idea behind pretext task. You first solve a pretext task, and then you apply it to the final downstream task. So your final task might be something else. It might be object detection. It might be something
Yeah,
like you're trying to detect this tree. But before doing that, you want.
like I used the like wrong term. What I'm trying to say is the pretext task. So in jigsaw solving, the pretext task is solving the puzzle, right? So here the pretext task will be just to make these two representations similar. Here we don't really
Right,
even
yeah,
we are
yeah.
applying the same transform as jigsaw. We are not really trying to find the coordinates.
Yeah,
right?
correct. Yeah, that is right. So we are trying to find a basic representation from which we can start with, and then we can proceed to the final, say object. If at all it's an object detection problem, then you will proceed towards the object detection problem. So instead of using ImageNet weights, we are trying to build an alternative when you don't have enough data and you cannot use the ImageNet weights. Okay, so any other questions? I'll proceed to the math if you guys don't have any questions. Okay, so back to the contrastive loss function. Again, since over here we are only trying to minimize the distance between Vi and Vi transform, and we are not concerned about say Vi dash, which is any other image which is different from Vi, or rather I. We introduce this idea of contrastive loss function where we are not only minimizing the distance between similar images, but we are also maximizing the distance between different images. So you can view this as the negative logarithm of a probability distribution of a probability density function, which is P of Zi, Zj. So we are going to define P of Zj more formally over here. We are going to call this the noise contrastive estimator. So the noise contrastive estimator models the probability of the binary event I transform that originates from the data distribution as following. So we are essentially just trying to model the internal probability density function using this expression of h of Vi transform. So this expression is exactly identical to the one within this logarithm. I've taken these two expressions from different blocks, so they look a little different. Over here, the 2n value is sort of equal to the n over here, and they have sort of isolated the Vi transform term in the denominator. Whereas over here, we are assuming that j is less than 2n, and hence the denominator sort of contains this first term over here. So again, in the numerator, we have the two vectors that we are trying to minimize, the two similar vectors, Vi and Vi transform. We are trying to minimize the distance between the two. In the denominator, we sort of sample I dash from a huge negative set. So we define a negative set where we know for sure that I dash is different from I, and sample about n negative samples from that. So this is your noise contrastive estimator. So now, following the similar logic as the contrastive loss function, we define a noise contrastive estimator loss. So we are just trying to generalize VI and VI transform. You might want to apply more transformations on VI and VI transform. So we are going to take F of VI and G of VI transform just to have a better generalization. We will see in the next slide why we want such generalizations. So you again take the negative logarithm of VI and the H of VI and VI transform. But you not only want VI and VI transform to converge towards each other, you also want VI transform and VI dash to be divergent. So the first expression, sorry. Okay. The first expression ensures that VI converges to VI transform and sort of VI is divergent from VI dash. But we also want to ensure that VI transform is divergent from VI dash. So if you have a transformation of a given image, it is still different from any other image that you pick, right? So you also want to include that in your loss term. So hence you have the second term over here. And you take 1 minus that because you want it to be divergent. Okay, so again, the reason why we had F of VI and G of VI transform is due to this. So you might generate VI from a ResNet 50 architecture and VI transform similarly from a ResNet 50 architecture. But over here, you have divided the initial image into patches and you're sort of generating the embeddings from each patch and sort of summing it up. So you're representing the summation aspect of it as the G function. So hence you have G of VI transform and F of VI because the post processing is a little different over here and you sort of want to generalize over such kinds of post processing. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, you have a set of negative samples N, and we usually want this to be a very large set to ensure that your VI embedding vector is divergent enough from the negative samples. But the problem in practical training is that you sort of define batches and that sort of limits the size of your set of negative samples that you can use in a given batch. So you develop this idea of memory bank. So what you do is for each image, you sort of maintain a dictionary and you compute exponential moving averages of your F of VI embedding that you get finally. So you call this F of VI embedding as MI, and essentially you also want F of VI to converge to MI because MI is sort of a memory bank representation of F of VI as you train the model across patches. So suppose you have this tree image in the first batch, you take F of VI and you update the index, you update the MI value. As you move across batches and you encounter the same image again and again, you want to sort of compute the moving average of all these F of VI vectors and store them as MI. So that way, even though your batch size is limited, you use MI instead of F of VI, and hence you sort of represent a much larger set of images than you actually have in the batch. This is particularly true for the negative vector, the MI dash, the I dash vector that you're using. So your MI dash is representative of a much larger set of I dash than you would normally have with F of VI dash. So we also add another loss term because you also want MI to converge to F of VI. And not only have MI converge to G of VI transform. So you add a weight factor called lambda. The paper also talks about how the loss varies with lambda and how you must select lambda. I'm not going to discuss that, but you should certainly look up the last section of the paper, which discusses how you can set the value of lambda. Okay, so by doing this, you sort of successfully generate a set of embeddings that you can start with for your final object detection task, if at all you're trying to solve an object detection problem. So PIRL shows an improvement in performance over the regular supervised approach for the VOC07 dataset using faster RCNN. You can apply this to a variety of supervised learning problems. I've just taken object detection as one of the examples. Thank you. I have also left the link to the GitHub code of this implementation in case you guys want to take a look at it. So do you guys have any questions?
For the moving average of the calculation of the moving average for memory bank, did the researchers provide the number they are using? For example, last for how many of the last examples they calculate the moving average?
No, they have. I think there is no fixed. Uh, no, the paper does not talk about the window of the moving averages. I think that's something that you might want to decide on your own. But you naturally want the window to be larger, right? So n is a much larger set, ideally in few thousands. Usually, when you're using batches, you sort of limit yourself to say 512 or 1024 at max. I have hardly seen machines take on more than that when you have 16 GB of GPU. You might want to use values such as, again, it depends on what the size of your total data set is, but assuming that you have about 14 million images, I think you can easily take the moving average value to be around 10,000 or so. The window value, that is.
Yeah.
Any other questions?